Well, hello. Good to see everybody. I'm recording this on my daily walk on a beach somewhere in the northeast of England, which is where I live. And I'm going to use this backdrop to talk about the role of journalism in the coronavirus crisis, this global pandemic that we're all in the middle of for well over a year now. My name is Mark Deuze. I'm a professor at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I'm talking today about journalism and its role as a form of democratic resistance, specifically from the perspective of research that I've been doing for the last 6 or 7 years with my dear friend and colleague Tamara Witschge at the University of Groningen on startup journalism. Journalists all over the world are starting their own editorial collectives, businesses, companies, initiatives, deliberately outside, next to, or even in opposition to traditional or established mainstream news media. And this is not something particular to the West or to the global North. It's happening all over the world. We've done case studies of these kind of startups in many areas around the world, from Cuba and Colombia to Canada to Denmark to Italy to the Netherlands to Australia to Nepal to Uganda to South Africa. And secondly, I also want to reference really important work that a very dear friend of mine from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro has done, Beatriz Becker, on startups, on mapping the startup scene in Brazil. And her conclusions and our conclusions to a large extent align, but also differ somewhat. And I want to use that material as the basis for my brief video presentation today. And to get us started, we have to acknowledge that in the context of the global pandemic, the coronavirus crisis, a crisis does what it always does, is that it amplifies, it accelerates existing trends and developments, both for better and for worse. And in the context of journalism, this primarily means that three major developments that have all taken shape in the last 5 to 10 years or so have accelerated somewhat in this year, in these past couple of years. First and foremost, the ongoing precaritization of journalism. We see media companies all over the world laying off their workers, journalists and other media workers alike, increasingly opting to subcontract and outsource journalistic work, working with a core of permanently contracted employees and an ever-growing pool of part-time, independently working freelancers, sort of relying on content to produce by these sort of contingent and casualized services. We're often working on a project-per-project basis. It's something we've known for a long time from the film and television industry, for example, and we see now happening in the news industry as a new dominant way of working and being at work. A second trend, coinciding with the first one, is a ongoing, I wouldn't say decline, but gradual erosion and a change of the quality of public trust in the news media in general and journalism in particular. It's not that trust is declining so much, is that it definitely isn't growing, and that it's becoming more articulated, in a sense that it's not that people say, well, I read the newspaper, but I'm not quite sure all the time what their agenda is or whether they speak the truth. It's more that they're more locked in to positions of distrust, of not knowing how to assess the enormous amount of information that comes at them on a day-to-day basis. And to some extent, journalism is not helping. A third trend ties into the second one, which is one of ongoing disintermediation. We see that state actors, political parties, governments, politicians are becoming increasingly skilled at bypassing the media altogether, communicating directly to their constituencies, to the community, to citizens, and often doing so by attacking journalism. So it's not just enough to, open up your own Twitter account as a politician and use that as your broadcast medium, but to make your message in part about this distrust of journalism and the work that journalists do. And so these three trends together form a formidable challenge to journalism, at the same time as they offer opportunities to strike out on your own, to work independently, and to come up with ways of doing journalism outside or beyond the mainstream organization of particularly legacy media. Secondly, the erosion of public trust offers opportunities to rekindle relations with the audience, to engage the audience, to work on local, hyperlocal or community levels, and to change the definition of the impact of your reporting from distribution, in other words, reaching as many people as possible, to impact, to making a difference, even if it's just on your street corner, even if it's just on the lives of 4 or 5 people. It doesn't matter. It is all about impact. And thirdly, yes, it is sad that politicians, especially populist ones, play on public distrust of news media. But at the same time, you could argue that traditionally the relationship between parliamentary reporting, state and government reporting, and politicians and political parties was way too intimate and was often too formally organized through press conferences and access. And if journalists are being deliberately pushed out and pushed away, that also gives them more freedom to report independently, critically about politics, about governance and governing, without risking a lack of access to these institutional arrangements. So we have problematic trends for sure, but also trends that create opportunities for journalism in a democratic environment. So in our project, when visiting and talking with all these startup companies and journalists all over the world, we found, I guess what you could say, 3 things that are important to my presentation today. The first one is we were reminded time and time again of the profoundly emotional nature of news work, of journalism as a distinct form of effective labor, of how people genuinely cared about their work, about the craft, about doing something well, about being creative, about experimenting and exploring and coming up with new things, about doing their work despite certain conditions that might seem impossible, like doing weekly television journalism in a country whose infrastructure was destroyed by a natural disaster like in Nepal, or under conditions of state control and censorship like in Cuba, or without any access to funding or money or subsidies like in South Africa, or in countries with incredibly well-established legacy media systems with little or no room for much market innovation, like in Denmark or in the Netherlands, for example, or in Canada. And yet, in all these circumstances, you see journalists from a wide variety of backgrounds striking out on their own and making it work, often primarily and sometimes even exclusively fueled by their personal commitment. A second theme that ran across all our case studies was the theme of making it work. Now, and traditionally we would talk about that theme from a perspective of business models, right? Advertising, sales and subscriptions. But most, if not all of these cases of these startups didn't work that way. I mean, they made money in all kinds of different ways, from performing live theater shows to organizing festivals to conducting workshops and conferences to acquiring national or international subsidies and grants. all kinds of different ways in which they subsidize their own work. But next to the financial aspects of making it work, there was very much the sense of the collective, of the social support structure of startup work, of being in it together, of being able to have a shoulder to cry on, or like in the case of one startup, singing a song together, as a form of emotional support, of just simply having fun, be part of a team, of feeling that you're part of something, which feeling was really lacking in traditional newsrooms with their fragmented working arrangements and being part of large industries or businesses. And a third theme was the theme of impact, of writing or shooting or editing or producing stories that matter. And this is distinctly different from the way we think about impact in terms of legacy media, which is primarily in terms of distribution, right? Reaching as many people as possible because that's good for the advertiser, that's good for the brand. And in this case, it was very much about serving a specific audience, often very local or very particular, or a specific way of thinking about the audience. Like in one case, a data journalism startup in South Africa primarily invested in conducting workshops for citizens to help them understand and use publicly available data to their own benefit, as well as making stories on the basis of all of that. So impact in terms of stories that matter, often outside of or beyond the traditional news agenda, making it work not just financially but more importantly perhaps socially, and finally being able to do the kind of journalism that you passionately believe in, the journalism that matters to you, journalism as a form of effective labor. And those three things really came across in all these different cases, however different these cases otherwise are. I mean, I think that's the final conclusion of our book. The book called Beyond Journalism that came out in 2020 with Polity Press, is we decided against the concluding chapter because there was no overarching theory of startup journalism to be made on the basis of this, because each and every case was unique, and that diversity, that differentiation was something we really wanted to celebrate, because it was something we learned from doing this particular kind of work. Now the question is, do these startups, whether in Brazil or anywhere else in the world, really make a difference in terms of democracy, and especially in the context of democratic resistance? Do they offer a meaningful alternative next to or even in opposition to traditional media? Do they offer other new, innovative, exciting ways of informing the public? Do they perhaps even provide an antidote to traditional news media and the public distrust thereof? And in her work on mapping the startups journalism scene in Brazil, Beatrice Becker concludes that, well, it's a bit of both. She considers them startups on the one hand in Brazil very much as a form of innovation, right? Often making it work with new and interesting business models, journalists driven by a desire to work outside of the mainstream, to be more critical of government, and truly serving the public. And on the other hand, she says, the startup scene in Brazil is also very much a force of conservation, in the sense that they embody the sort of neoliberal entrepreneurial model of, being independent and doing everything on your own and not relying on anything or anyone else. But that also makes these kind of companies and journalists extremely vulnerable. And generally, she acknowledges that, yes, they are very passionate and they really care about what they're doing and they want to do it outside of the mainstream, but their news values and the kind of stories they make aren't necessarily all that different. than traditional news values and the traditional sort of occupational ideology of journalism. Now, to a large extent, her conclusions about the startup scene in Brazil are very similar to those that Tamara Witschge and I drew about our global investigative startup journalism project. However, it is interesting to note that this definition of entrepreneurship that seems to underlie the desire of journalists to strike out on their own, to become independent, and especially to start their own collective or startup or their own company. That entrepreneurship wasn't the classical sort of neoliberal individualized definition of entrepreneurship, of trying to make it work on your own, not relying on anybody else, and just making a success of it, right? Taking risks and earning a living that way. In fact, the definition of entrepreneurship that we found in our case studies was much more social and effective and collective. I bring into memory what I said earlier about an important definition of making it work in the startups that we found wasn't so much financial, but it was social. It was about building a social support structure, about being part of a team, about not doing this on your own, which is very different from more sort of traditional business-oriented definitions of entrepreneurship. And I think this is really important. I mean, if journalism can make a difference in the world, is if it succeeds. And this has traditionally been the dilemma of journalism, right? If it succeeds to find a balance between, on the one hand, serving the public with being an independent watchdog of government and of business and of reporting the truth. It's a profession of verification, right? But all of that, all of those beautiful and important ideals always have to be balanced between, well, it also has to earn a living. I mean, it has to make money. I mean, most journalists work for commercial entities, and even the non-commercial ones have pressure to reach an audience, to serve an audience, and to remain economically viable. And there's always been that tension in journalism, traditionally, but especially with these startups. But then it's interesting to see that the way the startups sort of talk about this and engage with this balance is from a distinctive social and affective angle. And I think it's important for us to recognize this, because this is how we can build a force for good in democracy if people stick together, right? If we do it together, if we do it for each other and with each other, and not just as journalists, but also as journalists with their communities. And that's the second caveat I want to make in this research. In our research, the research of Beatrice Becker and so many other colleagues around the world that have done research in this area, is that a definition of impact away from distribution and more about engagement with a community also offers opportunities to think through the democratic role of journalism, not so much for abstract notions of the citizenry or the public sphere, but more specific about, these 5 people on that street corner, those groups of citizens, this particular community or constituency, which is especially encouraging given the erosion of local and community journalism in the last 20 or 30 years or so. In conclusion, what does this research teach us or help us understand about the role of journalism as a form of democratic resistance? Is that for us as researchers and as students and as observers of journalism, I think it's increasingly important that we recognize the effective nature of the profession and how appealing to that, tapping into that, acknowledging that may offer us ways of thinking about ways to do journalism that might differ from the tradition, that might offer new opportunities for organizing, for telling stories, and for reaching communities and working with communities. And I think that's the only real antidote to any kind of top-down, stage-run kind of meddling or interference with journalism as it functions today. And when we come back to a way of being and working and living beyond the pandemic. I want to continue something that working with Tamara on our Beyond Journalism project has taught me, which is to continue celebrating all the different ways in which we can be a journalist, in which journalists can do their work, both within and very much also outside of traditional media organizations. Amazing forms of journalism are everywhere. The problem is not the quality, the problem is access. It's getting to them, making people aware of them, and perhaps for journalists also to collaborate with people to make good journalism. Like former students of our program at the University of Amsterdam, for example, they in a theater in downtown Amsterdam, they organize live shows based on investigative journalism that they've done with specific communities within the city to tackle problems that these communities have identified in their environment. And they turn this research into a theater show for sold-out crowds. They've been nominated now for an innovation prize or award here in the Netherlands. And this kind of stuff for me is really inspiring. I mean, Zetland is a startup in Denmark that does something similar, that pioneered the form of theater journalism. And you've got so many examples. I mean, we continue to do case study research for this project, even though the book is already out. And every time I'm just amazed with what happens in journalism. I'm not naive. I do realize that these kinds of journalism are small scale, don't reach as many people as we would like them to, and often don't have a long life. But the point, however, is that journalism is in many ways thriving. And I think it's part of our responsibility as educators, as teachers, and as students, as scholars, as observers, to continue acknowledging this by not just looking at the O Globos and the New York Timeses of this world, or the Guardians or the BBCs, or any of the other legacy and traditional brands, but to look everywhere for people who commit acts of journalism. I think that's where the true democratic potential of the profession can be found, and that's where I will keep looking for it. Thanks for your time and your attention, and I hope you appreciate a presentation from a slightly different point of view, both literally and figuratively. I really enjoyed talking about this project, and I hope to see you soon, whether virtually or in reality, which today have become one and the same.